On the edge of the prairie as a storm bore down, Elias Hart stood alone, unaware that the night strangers would change his life forever. Elias Hart rose with the gray of morning, the kind of light that carried no warmth, only the thin promise of another day. His ranch stretched out across the edge of the prairie, where the land gave way to a horizon that never seemed to end. There was no town close enough to hear its church bells or smell its bread, only wind and grass and the sound of his own boots on dry earth. He spent his mornings as he always had, moving through small, stubborn labors. At the fence line, he drove a nail into split cedar with a hammer that had belonged to his father. Its handle bore the smooth polish of years, worn to fit the shape of calloused hands. The wire sagged like a tired sigh, and he tugged it back into place, the bite of rust staining his fingers. When the work was done, he leaned his weight against the post, gazing across the fields that rolled outward like a sea waiting for a storm. Back inside the house, silence pressed against the walls. Elias poured black coffee into a chipped tin mug, steam curling upward like a ghost rising. He cradled it in both hands, letting the heat seep into his bones. Beside the door leaned a rifle, its walnut stock rubbed smooth with oil, familiar as a prayer. He ran his thumb along the grain, a ritual more than a need. In years past, that rifle had defended the ranch from coyotes, from rustlers, from silence itself. The air shifted by mid-morning. Elias could feel it first in his skin, a dampness riding beneath the breeze. The sky, once pale, grew bruised with a heavy purple, clouds swelling like dark bellies above the plain. Even the crows had fallen quiet, perched on the fence rail as though waiting for judgment. Storm weather. Elias remembered how his wife, Clara, had always known the signs before he did. She'd braid her long hair tight against her head when thunder threatened, saying order must be kept against whatever chaos might come down from the heavens. He could still see her in the lamplight of their old kitchen, fingers working deftly, the braid lying against her shoulder like a black rope. It was a memory both tender and cutting, as if time itself had left a scar across his chest. Clara had been gone 8 years now, taken by fever in the dead of winter, and yet the image of her braiding her hair lived on, sharper than any photograph. Alone now, Elias carried storms differently. They came not only with wind and rain, but with a hollowness that settled in his bones. He was anchored by duty, cattle to tend, fences to mend, the land itself demanding attention. Yet he lived with a silence so vast it seemed to echo. By late afternoon, the sky had hardened to iron. Wind pushed against the walls of the house, carrying with it the smell of rain not yet fallen. Elias set his mug aside and gathered what he could, latching shutters, checking the barn doors, laying a blanket across the saddle rack. His boots stirred dust that soon would be mud. He paused in the doorway of the barn, watching as the first drops began to fall, fat and cold, striking the earth like small warnings. The prairie darkened as if night had come early. The storm rolled in with a voice of its own, low and gathering. Elias braced himself for a long, solitary evening. Then through the curtain of rain, he heard it, a sound that did not belong to wind or thunder. A faint creaking, rhythmic, like the turning of a wagon wheel burdened by mud. He stepped to the gate, squinting through the sheets of water. Out on the road, figures moved. At first he thought it a trick of the storm. Shadows pulled from cloud and lightning. But no, there they were. A team of horses dragging a wagon, its wheels sinking deep into the soaked earth. He made out shapes. 3, perhaps 4 souls huddled against the downpour, shawls clinging to shoulders, hats bent low. Elias's first instinct was caution. Strangers on the prairie brought questions, and questions often carried trouble. He thought of his rifle by the door, of his solitude hard-earned and fiercely kept. Yet the storm howled louder, and he saw the way the wagon lurched as if ready to tip. Whoever they were, they would not survive long out here without shelter. He felt Clara's memory stir again, the way she used to gather travelers with a kind word, no matter how lean their own table was. She'd say, "A barn's no good if it holds only emptiness." So Elias raised an arm, gesturing toward the barn. He shouted against the wind, though he doubted his voice carried far. Still the wagon turned, struggling down the rutted path toward his gate. Rain hammered the roof, drumming like hooves in flight. Elias pushed open the heavy barn doors, light from his lantern spilling gold across the wet night. The figures drew, close, blurred by water, faces hidden in the storm's veil. He stepped back, giving them space, the smell of hay and horses mingling with the sharp scent of rain. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the prairie caught between fury and silence, Elias caught between solitude and company. Strangers were coming into his barn, and whether for good or ill, the shape of his night, perhaps even the shape of his life, was about to change. The barn door groaned shut against the wind, and the world within was narrowed to the lantern's glow and the smell of wet earth. Elias hung the lantern on a hook, its flame quivering with each breath of storm that slipped through the boards. Shadows stretched long across the rafters, bending over saddles, pitchforks, and the restless shapes of his horses. The strangers stood dripping on the packed dirt floor, rainwater running from their clothes, their boots heavy with mud. Elias studied them in silence, though he tried not to stare. The mother removed a shawl from her shoulders and laid it across a hay bale, steam rising faintly from the soaked fabric. Her daughter, no more than 16, clung to her arm. The girl's braid, darkened by rain, glistened like rope in the lantern light. Her eyes moved upward, searching the roof beams as though she half expected them to collapse. The third figure, a man older than the woman but not kin by the look of him, carried himself with a soldier's caution. His beard was touched with gray, his eyes deep-set beneath a broad-brimmed hat. When he set his rifle down against a stall post, he did it with care, as though reminding Elias he meant no harm, yet never forgetting the weight of the weapon itself. Elias cleared his throat. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, rough from disuse. "You can bed down here for the night. Hay's dry in that corner. Water trough's clean." The woman looked up at him then, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She nodded once, a gesture of gratitude too tired for words. The girl pressed closer against her side, and the man gave a grunt of thanks before lowering himself to sit on an overturned bucket. The storm outside was not content to be forgotten. It struck the barn in fits and gusts, rain driven sideways, through cracks in the wood. The boards shuddered as though giants leaned upon them. Elias moved among his horses, calming them with a steady hand, though he felt no steadiness within himself. The presence of others filled the space so completely he could scarcely think. For years he had moved alone through this barn, his own footsteps the only rhythm. Now there were voices in the air, low whispers between mother and daughter, the cough of the older man, the rustle of damp shawls being wrung out. Elias set a bucket of water near them. The mother dipped her hands, rubbing the mud from her daughter's fingers, then drew the braid between her palms, smoothing it with trembling care. The gesture was so familiar, it caught Elias unprepared. He remembered Clara sitting by the hearth, braiding her niece's hair on visits, each loop and twist a silent promise of safety. That simple act of order against disorder struck him like a stone, and he turned away, busied himself with kindling. He lit a small fire in the iron stove at the far end of the barn. The smoke curled into the loft, carrying the faint scent of pine. From a shelf, he brought down bread wrapped in cloth and a small pot of coffee left from earlier. He set them on a barrel between them. "It ain't much," he said, "but it'll take the edge off." The girl looked at the bread as though it were feast enough. She tore a piece carefully, offered half to her mother before tasting her own. The older man drank the coffee in slow swallows, the steam fogging his beard. Elias took only a little, himself, preferring to watch, to listen. They gave him no names, and he asked for none. Yet stories were carried in the silence, thick as the smell of wet wool. Elias saw the way the man's hand hovered near his rifle even as he ate, how the mother kept her eyes fixed on the girl as though measuring each breath she took. They were running from something, that much was plain. Debt or violence, law or lawlessness, and the prairie bred both. But Elias knew better than to pry. A man asked nothing of strangers in a storm. The thunder deepened, rolling like iron drums, across the sky. Rain beat the roof until it seemed the whole barn might lift and fly. The horses shifted uneasily, their hooves striking dull against the floorboards. For a moment, the lantern flared, threatened to die, then righted itself, its flame steady again. Elias sat on a crate opposite them, the fire's warmth spreading slowly through the chill. He studied their faces in the flickering light. The mother's cheek hollowed by hardship, the girl's eyes wide with something older than her years, the man's jaw set with secrets he would never voice. He realized then how long it had been since he had seen strangers in his barn, longer still since he had shared bread with anyone at all. The sound of their voices, low and cautious though they were, unsettled him, and yet beneath the unease he felt something stir. It was not comfort, not yet. More like the ache of an old wound, long ignored, being touched for the first time in years. The girl looked up once, catching his gaze. For the briefest heartbeat, neither looked away. Her eyes were clear, searching, carrying both fear and trust. Elias felt the weight of it, then lowered his gaze to the fire. The storm raged on. The barn stood fast, and within its walls, 4 souls shared warmth and silence, each bearing unspoken stories. Elias Hart, who had lived so long with only the company of ghosts, felt the strangeness of being surrounded by life again. For the first time in years, the barn was alive with voices not his own. And though he told himself it was only for the night, he knew already that something in him had shifted. The storm came down harder as the night deepened, a hammering that shook the barn to its timbers. Rain lashed the roof like handfuls of gravel, wind howling through the cracks, boards groaning with every gust. Lightning flared across the prairie, white scars etched upon the black, and for a moment the loft was lit like day, every beam and rope sharp as a blade. Then darkness again, heavier than before. The barn creaked like a ship adrift in angry seas. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, their breaths clouding the air. The lantern's flame wavered, throwing restless shadows across the strangers gathered inside. They spoke little at first. The storm was voice enough. Yet storms have a way of loosening tongues, as though thunder itself demands confession. It was the mother who broke the silence. Her shawl had dried some by the stove, but her eyes still carried the weariness of miles traveled. She stared into the small fire, the glow softening the lines of her face. "We left a town that turned mean," she said quietly. "A place where men owned every acre with their fists and their ledgers. My husband worked himself down to bone paying them, and when he died, the debts remained. They came to the door for more, though all that was left was a girl and me." Her voice faltered, but she did not weep. Instead, she pressed her palm against her daughter's braid, smoothing it with the same trembling patience Elias had seen earlier. The girl leaned into her touch, silent, but her shoulders spoke of burdens too heavy for her years. The older man shifted on his bucket seat, clearing his throat. His rifle rested against the wall, but his words carried the same weight. "I was no good at saving him," he said. "Her husband. I should have stepped in sooner. Thought the fight wasn't mine to take, and by the time I did, he was already in the ground. Since then I carry it with me, heavier than iron, heavier than this storm." He fell quiet again, and in the silence that followed, thunder rolled like judgment across the heavens. Elias could feel their story settle in the barn, heavy as the rain that battered its sides. He said nothing. He had no balm for their wounds, no wisdom for their regrets. He only listened, the way a man listens to the wind, knowing it cannot be stopped but must be endured. The girl who had spoken least of all lifted her eyes then. She studied Elias with a frankness that unsettled him, gaze drawn not to his face but to the tack-room door. Hanging there, nailed above the row of bridles, was a single photograph in a wooden frame. "Who is she?" the girl asked softly. "The woman in that picture?" Elias followed her gaze. For a long moment he could not find his voice. The fire cracked, rain hissed on the roof, and the barn leaned in upon his silence. At last, he spoke, each word drawn from a well long sealed. "My wife," he said. "Clara. She sewed her own wedding dress out of curtain cloth, said it was good enough, and she made it beautiful just the same. We married under the cottonwoods, river running close by. She kept this place alive with her hands and her laughter. When the winters turned hard, she spun thread, baked bread from the last of the flour, braided her hair each morning as though to keep herself steady. Then one winter, fever came. Took her fast, and no prayer nor doctor could turn it aside. He stopped there, his throat thick. He had not spoken her name aloud in months, maybe years. Saying it now filled the barn with her presence, a ghost more real than memory. The mother bowed her head as if in respect. The older man shifted uneasily, guilt and grief alike in his posture. The girl watched him with eyes that seemed too knowing, too tender. Elias felt stripped bare before them, his solitude pierced by their witness. The thunder outside split the sky in two, rattling the barn from roof to foundation. Yet within those trembling walls time seemed suspended, the storm holding them in its grip as surely as their shared sorrow did. 4 lives, each bent beneath loss, each bound together in that fragile shelter of firelight and rain. Elias drew a long breath. He felt the weight of his grief mingle with theirs, not doubled but strangely lightened. Perhaps sorrow, when spoken, lost a measure of its sting. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that grief was not his burden alone, that others carried wounds as deep, and still they endured. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, a different quiet took hold. The girl leaned against her mother, eyes drifting, closed. The older man rested his hand on the stock of his rifle, but more as habit than need. Elias sat by the fire, staring at the braid of smoke curling into the rafters, and thought of Clara, her hands at work, her voice in song. It struck him then that grief was a language spoken without instruction. One glance at a photograph, one touch of a braid, one silence shared through a night of thunder. And strangers could understand one another as though they had lived side by side. Outside, lightning burned the horizon, the prairie lit white, as bone. Inside, the barn held steady, 4 souls bound by sorrow, yet steadied too by the fragile comfort of not being alone. The long night stretched on. The storm broke in the small hours, slipping away like a thief at the edge of night. When dawn finally came, it was pale and hesitant, as though unsure it was welcome after such fury. Elias opened the barn doors and stood blinking into the soft, gray light. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and cedar, the prairie stretching before him as a field of broken glass. Rain had scoured everything clean and left behind its wreckage. The pasture lay torn, tufts of grass flattened in wide swaths. Branches from the cottonwoods littered the yard like the bones of some fallen creature. Fence posts leaned drunkenly, wire twisted and sagging where the wind had forced it down. The storm had passed, but its handprints remained everywhere. Elias stepped out, boots sinking into the mud. He had expected this silence, the hush of land stunned after violence, boing. But he expected something else as well, that when he turned back the wagon would be gone, its travelers vanished into the washed horizon. Strangers seldom stayed longer than necessity required. Yet when he looked over his shoulder, he saw them emerging from the barn. The girl pulled a shawl tight across her shoulders, the wool still damp, though she no longer shivered. Her braid hung heavy down her back, streaks of rain still caught within it. She bent without hesitation, gathering fallen branches into her arms, stacking them neatly by the wall as though tidiness itself might restore the land. The older man followed, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate weight of someone who knew hard labor well. He righted a fence post with a grunt, sinking it deeper into the softened earth, then began the work of lashing wire back in place. His rifle, Elias noticed, was left leaning inside. The mother was last, stepping into the mud with quiet resolve, her dress hem darkened with water, but she knelt without concern, lifting tools Elias had left rusting near the shed. Her hands moved steadily, testing the weight of a hammer, the edge of a spade. She looked like a woman measuring herself against work she had no choice but to do. Elias watched them for a long moment, disoriented. His land had always been his alone, his burden, his keeping. He had grown accustomed to carrying it like a yoke no one else could lift. Yet here they were, strangers knee-deep in his mud, setting order back into a world the storm had torn apart. Something inside him shifted, quiet but undeniable. He joined them. Together they worked through the morning, the chill air filling with the rhythm of labor. The girl stacked wood in careful rows. Her shawl slipped often from her shoulders, but she never paused long enough to fix it. The older man carried posts like beams across his back, his breath fogging in the dawn. The mother steadied each tool. Elias handed her, as if she had always belonged in this place. Elias himself lifted, hammered, tied, and hauled, though he found his eyes drawn again and again to the sight of others working beside him. It unsettled him in its strangeness. For years he had listened only to the scrape of his own shovel, the groan of his own muscles, the silence that followed each finished task. Now the air was alive with sound, the snap of branches, the thud of posts set firm, the quiet murmur of voices as mother and daughter spoke in low tones, sometimes even laughing. Laughter. It startled him. He had nearly forgotten how it sounded in the open air. Light as birdsong, yet carrying a weight of life his ranch had long been without. The hours passed unnoticed. The sky brightened, clouds pulling back like curtains to reveal a pale sun. The mud began to harden, earth drawing itself together again after being torn apart. Work songs drifted from the older man, deep and rough, the kind sung to mark time rather than to impress. The girl hummed along in places, her voice clear as water. Elias felt the cadence slip into his own rhythm until his hammer struck in time with their melody. By midday, the ranch already bore signs of repair. Fences stood straighter. The yard was cleared of branches. Tools, once left neglected, had the sheen of use again. The land still showed its scars, but they were being stitched closed by the steady persistence of hands that refused to leave it ruined. Elias stepped back at one point, resting his weight on the handle of a shovel. His breath came heavy, his shirt damp with sweat. He looked around at the girl wiping her brow with her shawl, at the mother straightening from her kneel, at the older man testing the firmness of the last post he'd set. The barn loomed behind them, doors open wide, no longer a hollow vessel of solitude but something alive, breathing with effort and companionship. Elias felt a warmth rise in his chest, strange and quiet. Not joy exactly, not relief. Something, more fragile. The tender astonishment of a man realizing that healing often arrives disguised as ordinary labor. He had not invited them into his life beyond a night's shelter, yet here they were, giving more than he had dared to ask as... The sun climbed higher. Elias fetched a bucket of well water and passed it around. They drank deeply, passing the tin cup from hand to hand. No one spoke much, but the silence was no longer sharp. It was softened, filled with the shared knowledge of work done together. For Elias, it was as though the land itself had changed, overnight. Not only the fences and the branches, but the air, the sound, the weight in his chest. Where there had been hollowness, there was now something like wonder. Fragile still, but real. And as he looked at the strangers, these travelers who had arrived in the storm and stayed into the dawn, Elias Hart felt the first stirrings of something he had long forgotten, the comfort of not being alone in the tending of the world. The day stretched long and bright after the storm, the sky scrubbed clean to a pale blue. Sunlight lay across the prairie in wide strokes, catching on wet grass that glistened like blades of glass. The land looked both wounded and renewed, broken in places yet alive with possibility. Elias had expected the strangers to take their leave once the worst of the damage was mended. But no such preparations came. The wagon remained where it had been left, its wheels sunk deep in the mud, and the horses stood tethered, resting. Instead of departure, there was only the quiet continuation of labor, as natural as if they had always belonged here. The girl worked with unself-conscious energy, her braid dark with yesterday's rain yet gleaming when the sunlight caught it. She moved lightly across the yard, collecting stray boards, stacking them with careful order. Her hands were small but quick, turning chaos into neat piles that spoke of discipline learned young. Every so often she glanced at Elias, not shy, but measuring, as though trying to understand the man whose barn had opened to her in the storm. Her mother was slower, her movements steadier, but no less capable. She tied rope around the fence rails with hands that bore both callous and grace, fingers deft in their knots. She seemed to find rhythm in the work, each knot pulled tight like a stitch closing a wound. When Elias offered her a tool, she accepted it without hesitation, as though his hammer and his land were not foreign but familiar. The older man labored without complaint, his frame solid as the posts he shouldered. He worked as one accustomed to toil, not quick, but enduring. Elias noticed his rifle leaning against the barn, set aside, forgotten for the first time since the storm began. The sight of it there, weapon idle, hands turned to repair, struck Elias with quiet meaning. Perhaps even men who carried guilt heavier than iron could find reprieve in honest work. Elias himself moved among them, lifting, mending, steadying. Yet his eyes returned again and again to the strangers, to the gleam of the girl's braid, to the mother's strong, capable hands, to the rifle left against the barn, no longer a shadow over the day. He found himself startled by how natural it felt to share the tools he had guarded so long, to see them worn smooth again by the grip of others. The land bore witness to their efforts. Fences rose back into line, their posts firm in the soil. Branches were cleared, their sharp ends stacked for kindling. The barnyard, once scattered with storm's wreckage, began to breathe again, not only as a place of labor, but as a place alive with the pulse of life restored. Time passed differently, under such company. The hours of toil did not weigh Elias down as they usually did, but seemed to lift him. He felt his solitude thinning, breaking apart not with pain but with the gentleness of thawing snow, the earth beneath it stirring to green. When the sun bent, westward and shadows stretched long across the prairie, Elias set down his tools. He fetched a lantern, trimming its wick until it glowed steady and warm, and set it on a barrel by the barn doors. Its light spilled gold into the coming dusk. From the kitchen he carried out a pot of coffee, black and bitter, and poured it into tin cups he had not used in years. They gathered there in the open air, the labor of the day still clinging to their clothes and skin. The girl sipped carefully, wrinkling her nose at the bitterness but smiling all the same. Her mother drank slowly, the steam rising across her face. The older man held his cup as though it were a rare comfort, savoring each swallow. Elias himself drank little, more taken with the sound of their voices mingling, low and unguarded, rising into the evening air like a tune. Laughter came again, soft, uncertain at first, then freer. The girl told some small tale of their wagon ride, how one of the horses had balked at a rabbit darting across the road. The mother chuckled, her voice rich despite weariness. Even the older man let slip a smile, his beard shifting like a curtain, parting. Elias listened. He had no stories to add, but he found himself warmed not by words spoken but by their sound, by the cadence of lives shared without fear. For years, his evenings had been filled only with the scrape of a chair, the creak of the rocker, the whisper of wind against the walls. Now he heard voices, laughter, the scrape of tin cups against the barrel's wood. Music of a kind he had forgotten existed. The prairie around them dimmed, shadows pooling in its hollows. The lantern's glow grew richer, softer, as though holding the small circle of their company against the vastness of night. Elias felt something root itself within him, a reminder that trust, kinship, even hope, were not as dead as he had believed. They had not vanished with Clara, nor with the passing years of silence. They had only lain dormant, waiting for the touch of hands not his own to stir them awake. He sat back in his chair, coffee warm in his palm, and let the sound of their voices wash over him. The ranch, his barn, the land itself, all felt altered, transformed not by wealth or fortune, but by the simple gift of human presence. It was then Elias realized what had been broken was not only the fences or the branches, but himself. And what had begun to mend was not only the land, but the quiet place within him that had long believed itself beyond repair. The night deepened, the lantern burned steady, and for the first time in many years Elias Hart felt the peace of knowing he was not alone in the work of hands. Morning came gentle and pale, as though the sky itself wished not to disturb what had been mended in the night. A faint mist clung low across the prairie, rising in delicate veils from the sodden ground. The storm's ruin had been tidied by steady hands, and though the land still bore its scars, it no longer seemed defeated. The fences stood straighter, the barn door swung clean on its hinges, and the air carried the faint sweetness of damp earth drying beneath the sun. Elias stepped outside with the dawn, coffee warming his palms, and found the strangers already moving about the yard. Their wagon had been pulled from the mud, its wheels scraped clean. The girl brushed the horses with brisk strokes, her braid tight and shining in the new light. Her mother folded shawls now dry, shaking them out before draping them neatly over the wagon seat. The older man tightened straps and checked harness, buckles, each movement precise, practiced, as though departure were a ritual he had lived through many times before. The sight stirred something in Elias. He had half expected, half hoped, they might linger. But people bound for the horizon seldom stayed where storms had left them shelter. Their business, their burdens, their reckonings belonged to the road, and Elias knew better than to wish otherwise. They came to him with quiet words, not speeches, not grand thanks, only nods, murmurs, a meeting of eyes that carried more than phrases could. The mother stepped closer, her shawl drawn snug, and pressed something into his hand. Elias looked down and saw a braid of horsehair, black and chestnut twined together, bound at the end with a strip of faded ribbon. It was small, no larger than his thumb, but it lay heavy with meaning. Not payment, for there had been no debt between them, but remembrance, a token to carry forward when faces blurred and voices faded into distance. Elias closed his hand around it. The texture was rough and smooth all at once, alive with the memory of the storm and the hands that had worked beside his own. He met the woman's gaze and gave a single nod, for words would have broken the quiet grace of the moment. Then they mounted the wagon. The girl climbed with nimble steps, her braid swinging behind her like a dark ribbon. The older man flicked the reins, and the horses leaned into their harness with a grunt of effort. The wheels rolled, slow at first, then sure, carrying them down the track that led east across the prairie. Elias stood by the gate watching. The wagon grew smaller, its wheels turning against the pale grasslands, the figures within it shrinking, to shadows, and then to memory. When at last they dipped beyond the rise of land, vanishing from sight, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence that had filled his days before. He turned back toward the ranch. The yard looked altered, though the buildings had not moved. Every fence post set, every tool lifted, every breath of laughter left behind seemed woven into the place. Even the barn, with its scarred boards and crooked roofline, seemed to breathe differently now, as if it had absorbed the hum of voices and could not quite return to stillness. Elias walked the fence line. He trailed his hand along the rails, feeling the grain of wood, the new strength of posts driven deep. He paused at the pasture's edge where the grass bent and shimmered in the wind, and he remembered the girl's laughter as she stacked boards in neat piles. He saw the mother's hands steadying rope, knotting order into chaos. He saw the older man's rifle, leaning idle against the barn wall, its purpose set aside for the span of a day. These images clung to him like shadows warmed by firelight, not haunting, but companionable. He realized then that solitude need not mean emptiness. Silence could hold echoes, and echoes could be enough to carry a man through. As the day wore on, Elias moved through his work with a steadier heart. He fed the stock, mended a hinge, stacked wood against the wall. Each task seemed touched by the memory of shared labor, and the land felt less like a burden and more like a partner. When the sun dipped low and dusk drew its cool shawl across the prairie, Elias took his seat on the porch. The rocker creaked beneath him, the sound familiar, yet it no longer struck him with loneliness. In his palm he held the braid, horsehair, bound by ribbon, a token of presence now gone. He turned it between his fingers, feeling its coarse strands, its knot of remembrance. It seemed to him a symbol of what storms could bring, not only ruin but renewal, not only fear but kinship forged beneath thunder. The lantern at his side flickered to life as twilight deepened. Beyond the porch, the land lay wide and quiet, its scars softened in the fading light. Elias breathed deep, the air cool, touched, with the faint smell of rain still clinging to earth and grass. He thought of Clara, of her habit of braiding her hair before storms, a gesture of order against chaos. He thought, too, of how grief had once convinced him he was finished, emptied beyond the reach of fellowship. Yet here, in his hand, lay proof that even in the leanest years, mercy could arrive unexpected, not in grand miracles, but in strangers, who sought only shelter and left behind something more. The prairie wind whispered through the yard, bending the grass, rattling the boards. Elias leaned back in his rocker, the braid resting in his palm, and let the quiet settle around him. Alone, yes, but no longer hollow. For he had learned that sometimes strangers came not to take, but to return what a man believed lost: trust, kinship, and the faint, steady flame of hope. And in that knowledge, beneath the vast and tender sky, Elias Hart let the night embrace him, his solitude no longer a burden but a space made ready for whatever mercies tomorrow might bring.